If all countries in the world are in debt, who is the real creditor? At first glance, this question may seem simple, but it actually reveals one of the biggest paradoxes of the modern world, because we have been taught since childhood that debt is not a good thing. Yet today, the global economy cannot take even a single step without it. But what if I told you this? The promise that politicians constantly repeat, "We will pay off the debt," may sound like a responsible goal, but could it actually be a global suicide note? Especially for the United States, the answer to this question is far more complex and darker than you think, because the more than $30 trillion of debt that the U.S. holds is not just a responsibility, but also a foundation upon which the entire world is built. Most individuals think of government debt like credit card debt, something that is borrowed and one day fully repaid. But government debt does not work this way. In fact, it was never designed to work like that. U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the most reliable financial assets in the world. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and even other countries buy these bonds because these assets are essentially the building blocks of the financial system. Now, to understand this better, let's use a metaphor. Imagine the global economy as a massive bridge, and the cables of this bridge are reliable assets. U.S. Treasury bonds are the thickest and strongest of these cables. If one day this cable suddenly disappears, no matter how strong the bridge is, it will collapse. In the same way, if the United States one day comes out and says, "We have paid all our debt, we no longer have any debt," it would actually destroy the most reliable structure of this system. Banks would lose their strongest source of security, investment funds would lose their safe zones, central banks would lose their reserves, and the most critical consequence would be this: the amount of dollars in the market would rapidly decrease. This is because a very large portion of the money in circulation today exists thanks to the chain of debt. What I mean is, when someone takes on debt, new money is essentially created. Because of this, debt is not just a burden, but also a mechanism for creating money. If you completely eliminate debt, you are essentially removing money itself. And this leads to a situation in the economy known as deflation. It may seem like prices are falling, but in reality, people cannot spend money, companies collapse, unemployment rises, and the economy becomes stagnant. Now let's go back to a historical moment, because this repeating system did not suddenly appear. The year was 1694. England was at war with France, and the state had run out of money. At that moment, the British government made a radical decision. It would borrow money from merchants and in return, pay them back with interest. This decision was not only a solution to finance a war, but also the beginning of the modern financial system. During this process, the Bank of England was established, and government debt became not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength, because the more reliably a state could borrow, the stronger it appeared. In other words, debt became a measure of the ability to rule. That is why today the large debt of the United States does not mean it is weak. On the contrary, it shows that it stands at the very center of the system. However, there is a very common misconception here. People often say all of the U.S. debt belongs to China. This is not true. A large portion of U.S. debt belongs to its own citizens, its own institutions, and its own financial system. China is just one of the players within this system. So the issue is not a simple relationship of debt between countries, but a much more complex network. In this network, all countries are both debtors and creditors, and the system is built on this balance. Now let's come to the most disturbing truth. In the modern financial system, debt was never designed to be fully repaid. Yes, you heard that right. For the system to continue, debt must constantly renew itself. Old debts are silenced with new debts. Economists call this refinancing, and it is through this cycle that the system keeps going. If one day this chain stops, in other words, if new debt can no longer be created, then a real crisis begins because the fuel that powers the system runs out. That is why the statement, "We will eliminate the debt," may sound good, but if actually implemented, it would collapse the system. Moreover, this system does not benefit everyone equally because the interest generated from debt usually flows upward, meaning there is a transfer of wealth from taxpayers to large financial institutions. This turns the system not only into an economic issue, but also a social one, because the taxes you pay become someone else's profit, and this chain continues. At the foundation of all of this lies one thing: trust. Yes, just trust. As long as people believe that this system will continue, that debts will be managed, and that money will retain its value, everything functions smoothly. But if this barrier of trust is broken one day, then numbers lose their meaning, because money is not just paper or a digital figure. It is a belief. And when that belief collapses, even the largest economy in the world can suddenly become fragile like glass. That is why, if the United States fully pays off its debt, it would not be a success story, but rather the removal of the fundamental pillars of the global system, and this would affect not only America, but the entire world. Perhaps the real question should be this: is eliminating debt more dangerous, or is sustaining it forever more dangerous? Because the biggest secret of the modern world is that debt is not a problem, but the system itself. And whether we realize it or not, each of us exists within this system as both a debtor and a creditor. And the moment this system breaks, everything will have to be rebuilt from the beginning. If this explanation gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because we will continue to discover the answers hidden within history together.